The most dangerous lies are not the loud ones. Loud lies are clumsy. They attract resistance. They force confrontation. The more dangerous kind arrive with the calm of routine. They borrow the shape of ordinary life and hide there until your own decency starts helping them survive. That is what many people misunderstand about betrayal. They imagine it begins when the truth is discovered. It usually does not. It begins when one person quietly decides that the other person's trust is strong enough to be used as shelter. Once someone reaches that point, the affair itself is often only the most visible symptom of a deeper corruption. The real betrayal is not that they lied. It is that they believed they had the right to manage reality on your behalf while still benefiting from your character. I did not understand that at the beginning of my marriage, and I did not understand it fast enough when my marriage started changing. For most of my adult life, I believed patience was one of the more honorable forms of strength. I thought if a man stayed calm, careful, and measured, then the people closest to him would know the difference between restraint and weakness without needing it explained. That was one of my blind spots. Another was more flattering, which usually means more dangerous. I believed that because I was observant, I would naturally be difficult to deceive for long. The truth is more uncomfortable than that. Quiet men are often easy to deceive precisely because we dislike disorder enough to keep giving the other person one more chance to tell the truth voluntarily. We keep interpreting in good faith long after good faith has stopped being reciprocated. My name is Adam Holloway. I'm 47 years old, and until a little under 2 years ago, I had been married for 15 years to a man named Ethan. We lived outside Portland in a neighborhood of wet cedar fences, sloped driveways, and the kind of quiet upper-middle-class homes where every porch light seems designed to suggest emotional stability. We had no children. That fact mattered more at the end than it did during the marriage, though not in the simple way people think. Our life was full enough without them. Or at least I believed it was. I worked in systems risk and continuity planning for a healthcare software group, which meant process failure, response planning, audit exposure, controls, and the 1,000 unromantic details that keep large organizations from discovering too late that confidence and competence are not the same thing. I liked that work because it rewarded sequence. A system either held under pressure or it didn't. Narrative did not count for much once failure started moving through real channels. At home, unfortunately, narrative counted for far too much for far too long. Ethan worked in regional events and partnerships for a boutique hospitality brand. He was attractive, verbally easy, socially fluid, and deeply comfortable in environments where half the real currency was atmosphere. When we met, I found that exciting. I was more inward, more careful, more likely to notice the structure of a room than to dominate it. He seemed to move through life with a kind of improvised brightness that made my own seriousness feel less solitary. In the beginning, I thought we balanced each other. I grounded him. He animated me. That is a story many couples tell in their first years, and sometimes it's even true. To be fair to both of us, it was true for a while. I do not want to flatten what we had into fraud simply because it ended badly. There had been genuine tenderness between us. Real loyalty, too. We survived layoffs, a move across state lines, my mother's illness, his brother's financial collapse, and one frightening period where Ethan's anxiety became so physically intense that I slept lightly for months because I was listening for the bathroom light to come on at 3 a.m. These things matter because betrayal feels different when it enters a relationship that once required actual courage from both people. You are not only grieving the loss of a future. You are grieving the corruption of something you had reason to believe in. If I am going to tell this honestly, I should say something unflattering about myself before I say more about him. I took too much pride in being stable. Not loudly. I'm not built that way. But inwardly, yes. I thought being the dependable one gave me a kind of quiet immunity against being fundamentally misread. I handled the bills, the insurance, the tax preparation, the retirement accounts, the home maintenance schedule, the emergency fund, the travel bookings, the logistical quiet in which a life becomes livable. I did not resent that. In fact, part of me enjoyed it. It made me feel useful in a way that did not require applause. The danger in that sort of usefulness is that once another person adapts to it, they can start treating the resulting stability as natural rather than chosen. Your effort becomes the climate. The climate stops being admired. Then, if they are restless enough, it starts being called dull. Ethan used to describe me as grounding. Later it became safe. Later still, with a softness he probably thought was insightful rather than cruel, it became predictable. He never said boring outright, at least not directly to me, but the hierarchy was there. He admired men who were spontaneous, social, impossible to fully plan around. Men with edges. Men who did not seem shaped by responsibility. At the time, I understood this as a difference in temperament. What I did not yet understand was that he had begun converting difference into status. His restlessness was becoming, in his mind, a higher form of aliveness. My steadiness was becoming evidence of a smaller internal life. That is a dangerous transformation in any marriage. It is one thing to feel different from your spouse. It is another to start feeling superior because of the difference. The phrase in the title, "Working Late," began as an explanation so ordinary I would have felt embarrassed to challenge it too hard if I hadn't eventually discovered what it meant. Ethan's work genuinely involved long events, vendor dinners, site checks, brand meetings, and all the after-hours social labor hospitality companies dress up as culture. So when he started coming home later more often, it did not strike me as impossible. What struck me instead was the tone around it. He became not merely busy, but lightly entitled to busyness. If I asked when he'd be home, the answer carried a trace of impatience. If I questioned the frequency of the late nights, he would say things like, "Not everyone can live on a 9-to-5 emotional schedule," which sounds clever until you notice it is really just a way of making practical inquiry look small. There was also another man, though I did not name him as such at first. His name was Owen. He worked for one of Ethan's vendor partners, specifically in venue branding and private client acquisition. I met him once at a launch event. He was the sort of man who had learned how to seem understated while still broadcasting expense. Soft voice, clean beard, excellent watch, no visible hurry. Ethan described him afterward as too polished to be real, which in retrospect was exactly the kind of dismissive phrasing people use when they are already assigning importance they are not ready to defend. I noticed the frequency of the name before I noticed its emotional gravity. Owen thought this. Owen hated that. Owen understood why certain clients paid more for atmosphere than quality. Owen had the best instinct in the room. None of those remarks were affair evidence. They were hierarchy evidence. Ethan had begun admiring another man's mind in that specific way married people often do right before they start telling themselves the admiration is merely professional. I noticed other things too. The phone was no longer simply a phone. It had become a small protected space. Not hidden in the childish sense. Managed. Face down more often. Carried into the bathroom. Checked with a softness in the face that people do not realize they wear when the message on the screen belongs to a private emotional life. But I did what careful men often do. I explained downward. I translated discomfort into fatigue, work pressure, seasonal stress, anything more civilized than the obvious. That is one of the hidden costs of dignity. It delays the moment you allow yourself to be right. The first serious crack came not through a hotel receipt or lipstick or some dramatic cinematic clue. It came through time. Ethan told me one Thursday that he had to stay late at the downtown property because a corporate client's event had blown up in some avoidable, expensive way. He sounded annoyed, which made the story feel plausible. Annoyance is good camouflage because it gives detail a moral texture. I texted him around 9 asking if he'd eaten. He replied at 9:17 with, "Still here. Disaster. Don't wait up." There was nothing suspicious in the words. The suspicion came from an hour later, when I happened to open our shared car app because I needed the mileage estimate for an insurance form. Ethan's car wasn't downtown. It was parked in the Pearl District, on a residential street 4 miles from the property where he was supposedly still here. I remember staring at the map for an embarrassingly long time. Not because I didn't understand what it showed. Because I was still, even then, trying to construct explanations worthy of my own self-image. Maybe valet overflow. Maybe a shuttle. Maybe app lag. That is what self-protective intelligence sounds like. It does not scream denial. It simply keeps inventing ways to avoid becoming the man who believes the ugly thing too early. He came home just before midnight smelling not like event work, but like expensive soap and a bar that uses citrus in cocktails because it wants you to feel the difference between spending and taste. He kissed my forehead and said, "Sorry. Long night." I looked at him and said, "I thought you were downtown." The pause was tiny. But once you have seen a pause like that with the correct meaning attached to it, you never confuse it again. He said. Ended up debriefing with Owen after. There it was. Not full truth. Just enough truth to rescue the lie already caught in transit. I nodded and said nothing else. That silence was not fear. It was the first useful decision I made. If I had pushed then, he would have had access to my uncertainty and all the emotional leverage that comes with it. He could have explained, narrowed, laughed, accused me of overreading, offered just enough confession to preserve a larger deception. Instead, I let the moment pass and started paying attention properly. That is when I learned where he really was, not only physically but morally. Over the next few weeks, the working late explanation appeared again and again. Sometimes downtown. Sometimes vendor dinners. Sometimes emergency prep for weekend launches. Each time I checked, not obsessively, but structurally. The car app. The account activity. Parking. Ride shares. Calendar overlaps. Nothing dramatic, just sequence. And sequence is where lies usually fail. Owen's neighborhood surfaced too often. One boutique restaurant. One wine bar. A hotel lounge. Then a condo garage charge that matched a building I later learned Owen lived in. By then, I no longer needed him to confess. I needed myself to stop protecting the last soft part of my imagination that still wanted innocence to survive. The part that hurt most was not the affair itself. It was how ordinary Ethan had made the deception sound while expecting me to continue being the calm husband beneath it. That is the deeper insult in many betrayals. The liar does not merely lie. He keeps relying on your character while doing it. He depends on your restraint to keep the house from becoming unlivable while he privately relocates intimacy elsewhere. I met with an attorney before I told him I knew. A woman named Carla Green. Mid-60s, exact, dry, not easily charmed by emotional complication once practical reality is involved. I laid out the late nights, the location data, the account patterns, the apartment building, the timeline. Carla listened and then said something I still think about often. The affair matters, she said. But the more important issue is that he clearly believes he still owns the timeline. That was exactly right. Ethan thought the marriage still existed on his terms. He thought he could decide when truth entered the room, how much of it entered, and what emotional weather should surround it when it arrived. That is one of the most common privileges selfish people award themselves in long relationships. They stop thinking of truth as shared reality and start treating it like managed disclosure. Once I understood that, I stopped seeing my silence as passivity. It became leverage. I changed very little externally. That mattered. I still made dinner when it was my turn. Still answered ordinary questions. Still showed up for the social commitments that didn't yet deserve collapse. But I stopped making his ambiguity comfortable. I stopped waiting up. Stopped softening my eyes after his late arrivals. Stopped asking questions designed to invite honesty from someone already benefiting from not offering it. The atmosphere changed. He noticed. One evening, while taking off his coat, he said, "You've been weird lately." I said, "No. I've just stopped pretending the story still works." He smiled then, but it was strained. "What story?" "The one where working late means what you say it means." That landed harder than a fight would have, because it told him he was no longer narrating alone. Then came the line that taught me more than any confession could have. He looked at me and said, "Sometimes you don't need every detail." That sentence is what finally stripped the whole thing down to its moral core. Affairs are often narrated as weakness, loneliness, confusion, hunger, all the usual human words. But that sentence was not weak. It was managerial. He was no longer merely hiding behavior. He was deciding how much reality I needed. That is a different kind of corruption. It assumes the other person's relationship to truth is yours to cure it. I remember saying very calmly, "That's not your decision." He shrugged in a way that still disgusts me when I remember it. Not every truth helps. There it was. He believed he was protecting the marriage by controlling reality, when in fact he was only protecting his power over the terms of its collapse. I did not argue. I went upstairs, brought down the printed account statements, the parking logs, the location records, the copied messages from the synced tablet he had forgotten about, and the draft petition Carla had prepared. I laid them on the kitchen table in order. Then I said, "I found out where you really were weeks ago." What changed in his face then was not only fear. It was disorientation. Because until that moment, he still believed he had time to choreograph the truth, to introduce it through his own language, in his own sequence, under his own emotional lighting. The papers on the table ended that privilege. He sat down slowly and stared at them. Then came the usual fragments. It wasn't supposed to happen. It started emotionally. It wasn't what I thought at first. He had been unhappy for longer than I knew. He didn't want to hurt me. All of which may have contained pieces of emotional truth, but none of which touched the deeper issue. So I asked the only question that mattered. When did you decide I was just someone who should live around the lie politely? He didn't answer directly, of course. They almost never do when the question is really about power. But the truth had already been revealed. Not only that he lied about working late. Not only that he was with Owen. The deeper truth was that he had come to believe my steadiness was part of the affair's infrastructure. He assumed I would remain the reasonable, measured husband beneath the deception because that was easier than imagining I had my own threshold, my own timing, my own right to act without waiting for his permission to know what was happening. The separation that followed was not dramatic. It was administrative in the cold, expensive way adult endings usually are. Account division. The house. The furniture. The social explanations no one wants to make but eventually has to. Owen shrank quickly once the affair lost its flattering contrast. That did not surprise me. Third parties often matter less than betrayed spouses' fear. They are usually mirrors, not centers. What stayed with me longer was the phrase working late, because it taught me something about how lies survive. They survive best when they borrow the shape of duty. Work, fatigue, pressure, responsibility. The liar hides behind those words not because they are especially creative, but because good people are trained to respect them. We are trained to be understanding of effort, late nights, stress, burden. That is what makes those covers so effective. They recruit your own decency into the deception. A year later, Ethan said to me during one of the final property follow-ups, "I really thought you'd confront me earlier." I looked at him and answered as honestly as I could. That was your mistake. Not because I was clever. Because he mistook my patience for helplessness, my restraint for confusion, and my silence for dependency. He thought the quiet husband would always need the loud truth delivered on his husband's terms. He never considered that I might simply be waiting until the facts no longer needed his interpretation. If there is any message worth carrying from my story, it is this. When someone lies about something as ordinary as working late, the most important question is not only where they were. It is what kind of person they have become while expecting you to keep living respectfully underneath the lie. Betrayal is not just the hidden dinner or the private room or the late-night message. It is the arrogance of believing you can keep borrowing another person's character while privately abandoning their trust. That is why silence matters. Not the frightened kind. The deliberate kind. The kind that lets the truth complete its own shape before you interrupt it with pain. Because once the truth is complete, you no longer need to win an argument. You only need to stop participating in the version of reality the liar built for your convenience. That is not revenge. It is simply what happens when patience stops protecting the other person and finally begins protecting you.